The gunshot came from the kitchen, sharp and metallic, and for a moment, nobody in the house breathed. Elena froze halfway down the staircase, one hand gripping the wooden railing so tightly her knuckles turned pale. The echo crawled through the walls like a living thing. A glass shattered below. Someone whispered a curse. Then silence returned, thicker than before. Elena's mind refused to move forward. Her brother Marco had been in that kitchen only seconds earlier. So had Victor Ramirez. The thought struck like cold water. She forced her legs to move. Each step creaked as if the house itself were warning her not to continue. The smell of burned gunpowder reached her before the sight did. Marco stood near the counter, breathing hard, his shoulders shaking. Victor lay on the tile floor beside the kitchen island, one arm twisted under his body. Blood spread slowly beneath him, dark and deliberate. Elena stared. The clock on the wall ticked 3 times before she found her voice. "Marco," she said quietly, as if saying it too loudly might break reality. Marco didn't turn. His eyes were fixed on Victor's body. The gun trembled in his hand. "He forced it," Marco whispered. "You didn't see what he was about to do." Elena stepped forward carefully, her heartbeat pounding inside her skull. Victor groaned. He wasn't dead. The sound was weak, but undeniable. Marco inhaled sharply. Panic flickered across his face like lightning behind glass. "He shouldn't be alive," Marco said. "I didn't mean I just wanted him to stop." Elena knelt beside Victor. Blood soaked through his shirt near the shoulder. Not the chest. Not fatal. Yet, Victor's eyelids fluttered open. His gaze found Elena first, then drifted to Marco. A crooked smile appeared through the pain. "You really think this solves anything?" he rasped. Marco raised the gun again instinctively. Elena stood up fast and grabbed his wrist. "No." Marco's breath came in broken pieces. "You don't understand." "Then explain," Elena said. Victor laughed weakly on the floor. "Yes, Marco. Explain. Tell her why you invited me here tonight." Marco's eyes flashed with fury. Elena felt the tension in his arm like a coiled spring. The kitchen lights buzzed overhead. "He stole it," Marco said through clenched teeth. "The ledger. The one father hid." Elena felt the word hit her chest like a falling stone. The ledger. Their father's records had destroyed lives when they surfaced 10 years ago. Political bribes, disappearances, quiet payments to silence witnesses. Their father died before anyone could question him. Marco had sworn the last copy of those records vanished with him. Victor coughed and winced. "Correction," Victor said slowly. "Your father didn't hide it. He left it with me." Elena's thoughts reeled. Why would he do that? Victor met her eyes. "Because he trusted me more than his own son." Marco lunged forward before Elena could react, but Victor spoke again quickly. "Kill me and the ledger still comes out." Marco stopped mid-step. Silence pressed in again. Elena felt the weight of the moment settle like fog over every object in the room. "What do you mean?" she asked. Victor exhaled slowly. "Insurance." Marco's expression changed. Not anger now. Fear. Elena noticed it immediately. She had grown up reading every shift in her brother's face. "You sent copies," Marco said. Victor's smile widened faintly. "Not copies. Something better." Elena turned between them. "Someone explain this." Victor lifted his head slightly despite the pain. "Your father kept secrets that could bury half this city. Judges, police chiefs, ministers. The ledger proves all of it." Marco shook his head violently. "He's lying." Victor ignored him. "And tomorrow morning," he continued calmly, "a reporter receives a package. If I fail to make a phone call tonight." Elena's chest tightened. Marco's voice dropped into a low, dangerous whisper. "You're bluffing." Victor shrugged weakly, which caused another flare of pain. "Try me." Elena stepped back slowly. The room suddenly felt smaller. The past, which she had spent a decade trying to escape, had walked straight back through the door carrying a gun and a bleeding man. Marco lowered the weapon slightly. His voice sounded hollow. "You shouldn't have come tonight, Victor." Victor's gaze flicked toward Elena again. "I didn't come to threaten you," he said. "I came to warn you." Elena frowned. "Warn us about what?" Victor hesitated. Something in his expression shifted, almost like regret. "The ledger isn't just history. Someone has been looking for it." Marco scoffed. "You expect us to believe that?" Victor's eyes hardened. "You think the people named in that book forgot?" Elena felt a chill crawl up her spine. Victor's breathing grew shallower. "They're already moving," he said. "And if that ledger surfaces without control, they'll burn everything down to keep it buried again." Marco paced the kitchen like a trapped animal. Elena watched him carefully. Beneath the anger, she saw something worse. Guilt. Marco had invited Victor tonight. He had known something was coming. Marco, Elena said quietly. What did you do? Marco stopped pacing. For a moment, he looked like a child who had broken something irreplaceable. I didn't know it would get this far, he said. You never know, Victor muttered from the floor. Elena felt the room tilt under the weight of unspoken history. She crouched again beside Victor, pressing a towel against the wound. You need a hospital. Victor shook his head faintly. Too risky. Marco laughed bitterly. You're worried about risk now? Elena shot him a look. He'll bleed out. Victor studied her face. You still think this night has a clean ending? Elena said nothing. Deep down, she already knew he was right. Marco leaned against the counter, staring at the gun like it had appeared in his hand by accident. The ledger was supposed to disappear, he said. I spent 10 years making sure nobody could find it. Elena turned slowly. You told me it was gone. Marco looked at her. The silence between them stretched painfully. I lied. The word landed heavier than the gunshot. Elena stood up slowly. Why? Marco rubbed his face. Because if you knew the truth, you would have tried to expose it. Maybe I should have. Victor watched them both carefully, as if studying the fracture forming between brother and sister. You still can, he said softly. Marco's head snapped toward him. Don't you dare! Elena felt anger rising through the shock now. How long have you been playing this game? She demanded. Marco hesitated. Victor answered instead. Since your father died. Elena turned back to Marco, stunned. Marco's voice cracked slightly. I was protecting you. Elena laughed once, bitter and disbelieving. By lying for 10 years? Marco's eyes glistened. By keeping you alive. Victor shifted weakly on the floor. The truth is, he said, your brother made deals with some very dangerous people to keep that ledger buried. Elena's stomach twisted. Marco's silence confirmed everything. What kind of deals? She asked quietly. Marco didn't answer. Victor did. The kind where someone eventually comes to collect. The kitchen door rattled suddenly in the wind outside. All three of them turned. Elena realized how exposed they were. Anyone could walk in. Anyone might already be watching. Marco spoke again, his voice suddenly tired. You weren't supposed to be here tonight, Elena. She met his gaze steadily. But I am. Victor coughed again, and this time the sound carried something darker. Blood seeped through the towel. Elena pressed harder. We're running out of time, she said. Marco stared at the door, thinking rapidly. The balance of power in the room had shifted without anyone noticing the exact moment. The gun in his hand no longer looked like control. It looked like a mistake. Victor's voice returned, barely above a whisper. If I die before that call, he said, the city burns tomorrow. Marco closed his eyes briefly. Elena saw the war raging behind his face. Finally, he spoke. Then you're not dying tonight. Victor smiled faintly again. Congratulations, he murmured. You just made things much worse. And somewhere outside the house, beyond the quiet street and the sleeping neighborhood, a car engine started and idled in the darkness like a patient predator, waiting for the lights inside to go out. Elena saw the reflection first, a smear of movement crossing the dark glass over the sink, and every muscle in her body tightened before her mind could name what it meant. We're not alone, she said. Marco turned instantly. Victor tried to push himself up, failed, and winced through clenched teeth. The engine outside cut off. Silence pressed against the walls again, but now it felt organized, deliberate, like the pause before a door gets kicked in. Marco moved to the kitchen window and bent slightly, careful not to silhouette himself. Elena hated how practiced the motion looked. He didn't behave like a man shocked by violence. He behaved like a man recognizing a pattern he had hoped never to see again. How many? She asked. Marco kept watching the street. One car. Victor gave a dry laugh. One car you can see. Elena stared at him. Who are they? Victor's face had gone gray beneath the blood loss, but his eyes remained sharp. Depends which debt came due first. Marco spun back toward him. Stop talking in riddles. Then stop pretending you didn't help build the riddle. Victor shot back. Outside, a car door opened. Then another. Soft. Controlled. Not the clumsy noise of drunken men or frightened neighbors. Elena felt a pressure begin behind her eyes. Every choice in the room seemed to arrive already poisoned. Tell me the truth now, she said to Marco, her voice lower than before. Not the version you made for me. Not the version you told yourself. The truth. Marco looked at her, and for a moment the fear in him was naked. After father died, people started calling. Not police, not journalists. Men with no names. They wanted to know where the ledger was. Another car door shut outside. Elena kept her eyes on him. And? I told them I didn't know. That part was true, Victor said. At first. Marco ignored him. Then they began leaning on everyone around us, former staff, old business contacts, anyone who might have heard something. One of them followed you home from university. Elena went cold. What? You never noticed, Marco said. I made sure he never came back. The way he said it hollowed out the air between them. Elena understood the sentence, and then a second later understood what it meant. What did you do? Marco hesitated too long. Marco, he swallowed. I paid someone to scare him off. Victor smiled without humor. And that was the night he learned how easy it is to outsource sin. Elena stepped back as if the words themselves had weight. She had spent 10 years believing Marco withdrew into the family business, out of duty, out of exhaustion, out of grief. She had not imagined that grief had become a corridor leading somewhere this dark. Outside, footsteps crunched lightly on gravel. They stopped near the front of the house. Elena could hear her own heartbeat. You made deals, she said. Marco gave a single stiff nod. I gave them small things, harmless things. Access to names father had already used. Old routes. Shell companies that were nearly dead. You fed them scraps and hoped they would stay loyal, Victor said. That never works. Marco's jaw tightened. It worked for a while. Until you started believing you were one of them. The front gate clicked. Elena turned toward the hallway. A shape moved past the frosted pane near the entry. Someone was walking the perimeter. Her mouth went dry. If they're here for the ledger, she said, then why aren't they breaking in? Victor answered this time. Because they don't know who controls it yet. They'll want to hear us before they choose who to bury. The statement landed with awful clarity. Whoever was outside did not simply want an object. They wanted leverage. They wanted the person most useful to remain alive just long enough to betray the others. Elena looked at Marco, then at Victor bleeding across the kitchen tile, and understood that every relationship in the room had already become negotiable to someone outside it. Can you make the call? She asked Victor. He studied her. You still think the call ends anything? Can you? Victor's expression shifted. Yes. Then do it. Marco stepped in front of him. No. Elena stared at her brother. If he misses the call, the package goes out. And if he makes it, the people outside know we still have room to bargain. We don't have room to bargain. We have a wounded man on the floor and strangers around the house. Marco's voice rose. You think I don't know that? I think you keep choosing the version of control that gets people killed. The words hit him harder than shouting would have. For 1 second, Marco's face emptied. Elena saw the pain there and hated that part of herself still cared how much it hurt him. Victor took advantage of the silence. There's a phone in my jacket. Elena moved toward the chair where Victor had thrown his coat earlier, but Marco caught her wrist. If you call, you commit us to him. Elena pulled free. And if I don't, I commit us to whoever is outside. She found the phone in the inner pocket. It was already unlocked. A timer glowed on the screen, counting down. 12 minutes. Below it sat a single contact labeled only with a time. 11:30. No name, no number visible. What happens when the timer ends? Elena asked. Victor answered with a tired exhale. A message gets released to 3 places. Reporter, Federal Archive, and someone who hates all of us enough not to care who falls first. Marco closed his eyes briefly. Elena saw the calculation in him turning savage now, stripped of illusion. Give me the phone, he said. No. Elena, no. The first knock at the front door echoed through the house. It was not loud. That made it worse. 3 deliberate taps, patient and almost courteous. Nobody moved. A second knock followed 10 seconds later. Then a man's voice, calm and clear enough to carry down the hallway. Marco DeLuca. We know you're inside. Elena's breath caught. Marco's face went still in a way she had only seen once before. At their father's funeral. When he had received condolences like stones dropped one by one into his hands. The man at the door continued. You need medical help in there. We can provide it. But this gets more complicated if you make us enter without permission. Victor murmured. Matteo. Marco looked toward the door. I thought he was dead. Victor almost smiled. A lot of people prefer him that way. Elena had never heard the name before, but the change in both men told her enough. Matteo was not muscle. He was history. Who is he? She asked. Marco did not answer right away. Another knock came, softer this time. He used to work for father, Marco said at last. Used to? Victor let out a ragged laugh. No one ever stops working for men like your father. They just start collecting from the ruins. Elena tightened her grip on the phone. The timer read 10 minutes. What does he want? She asked. Marco met her eyes. Probably me. Victor shook his head weakly. No. He wants the part of you that still believes you can sacrifice yourself and spare everyone else. That's the most useful version. The voice at the door returned. Marco, if you are still trying to decide whom to trust, let me save you time. Victor is not protecting you. He is protecting the ledger. Elena is the only innocent person in that house, and even she will not remain innocent much longer if you force this to continue. Elena felt a deep, involuntary chill at hearing her name spoken by a stranger outside her home. Marco moved toward the hallway. Elena stepped in front of him. Don't open that door. He already knows too much. Exactly. If I stall him, you take Victor out through the back. Elena stared at him. You think they left the back unguarded? Marco's answer was silence. It said enough. The lights flickered once. Victor looked toward the ceiling. Generator line's been cut, he said. They're getting ready. The house plunged into darkness. Elena flinched as the refrigerator died and the kitchen's electric hum vanished. Only the pale spill of streetlight through the windows remained, slicing the room into dim gray shapes. Somewhere upstairs, something wooden settled with a soft crack. The silence that followed was almost intimate. Marco drew in a breath. Stay low, he said. That's not a plan, Elena whispered. It's what we have. Another voice sounded outside now, farther off near the backyard. Then the faint metallic scrape of a tool against a latch. Victor pushed himself to one elbow and nearly blacked out. Elena dropped beside him. Don't. There's a loose tile under the pantry shelf, he muttered. Inside it, there's a key. Elena stared at him. How do you know that? Because this isn't my first desperate kitchen. The absurdity would have made her laugh on another night. Instead, she crawled toward the pantry, feeling along the floor with one hand while the phone glowed in the other. The countdown read 8 minutes. Her fingers hit the edge of a tile that shifted slightly under pressure. She pried it up. Beneath it lay a small brass key and a folded strip of paper. She took both. Marco crouched beside her. For what? Victor's voice came from the floor, thin but steady. Safe deposit box at Bellwether Trust, box 914. Elena unfolded the paper in the dark and caught the address of the bank, plus a date from 11 years earlier. Her father's handwriting. She knew the slant immediately. Her stomach dropped. You said father left the ledger with you, she whispered. Victor looked straight at her. I said he trusted me with it. That wasn't the same thing. Marco's face hardened. You son of a bitch. Victor ignored him. Your father split the archive. Ledger in one place, index in another. Without both, names are dangerous but incomplete. Elena stared from the key to the paper. The box has the index? Victor blinked slowly. Maybe. Marco laughed once, harsh and disbelieving. We're surrounded by armed men. You're bleeding out on my floor. And now you decide to mention another piece? Because before tonight, you only wanted to bury it. She might actually understand what it means to carry it. Elena felt Marco looking at her, but she kept her eyes on Victor. There it was again. The same infuriating thing he had said before. The same pressure that kept moving toward her like a door opening in increments. Responsibility. She had spent years running from her father's shadow because Marco told her that was the safest way to survive it. Now she was beginning to see the other possibility, the one nobody had let her test. Maybe safety had never been the point. Maybe control had been. A heavy thud struck the back door, once. Then again. Marco moved instantly. He grabbed a kitchen knife with his left hand and tucked the gun into the back of his belt. Elena almost laughed at how obscene it felt, the domestic shape of the knife in a room where everything else had become political. We can't stay here, she said. Marco nodded. There's a service passage in the cellar. Father had it built after the protests in '98. You never thought to mention the hidden tunnel? It wasn't meant to matter anymore, Victor muttered. That sentence could be on your grave. The front lock clicked. Not breaking. Opening. Someone had a key. Marco crossed the room in 3 strides and shoved a sideboard against the hall entrance. It would buy seconds, not safety. Elena tucked the brass key and note into her pocket, grabbed Victor under one arm, and tried to haul him upright. He cried out despite himself. Marco was beside them a moment later, lifting from the other side. Together, they dragged Victor across the kitchen toward the basement door near the laundry alcove. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked under a weight that did not belong in the house. Elena stopped breathing. They were inside. Move, Marco whispered. He yanked open the basement door. Cold air breathed up from below, carrying dust and damp concrete. Elena helped lower Victor down the first step, just as a violent crash exploded from the hallway where the sideboard gave way. A beam of flashlight cut through the kitchen in a sharp white slash. Marco fired once toward the hall, not to hit, just to force them down. Shouting answered immediately. Elena stumbled down the stairs with Victor's weight half on her shoulder. Marco slammed the basement door and dropped the bolt. Wood splintered on the other side almost at once. "That won't hold," Elena said. Marco switched on a small emergency lamp mounted on the wall. Yellow light flickered weakly across shelves of paint cans, old wine crates, rusted tools. The cellar seemed impossibly ordinary for a place that might decide whether they lived through the next 5 minutes. Victor sagged against the wall, sweating. "Third shelf," Marco said, already crossing to the far side. He shoved aside a stack of boxes, reached behind the shelving unit, and pulled a recessed lever. For one terrible second, nothing happened. Then a section of the back wall released with a grinding shudder and opened inward onto a narrow passage lined with old brick. Elena stared. How many lies fit in this house? Marco didn't answer. The basement door above them splintered again. A voice called from the stairs. "Marco, don't turn this into a massacre. Matteo, closer now, almost gentle. There's still a version where your sister walks away." Marco looked back toward the stairwell, then at Elena. Something passed through his face then. Something stripped clean by fear and love, and the exhaustion of holding too many decisions alone. "He's telling the truth about one thing," Marco said. "If it comes down to it, you leave me." Elena's anger flared so fast it steadied her. "Don't say that to me like it's noble. It's practical." "No, it's the same lie with better lighting." The words hit harder than she expected. Marco stared at her, and in that stare, she felt 10 years of him choosing damage in private and calling it protection. The stair door burst inward above them. Footsteps thundered down. Marco turned and fired twice. Screams, then a body falling. The narrow cellar amplified everything into chaos. Dust shook down from the beams. Victor nearly collapsed again. "Move," Elena snapped. She half dragged, half pushed him into the passage. Marco backed in after them and pulled the wall section closed from inside. Darkness swallowed the sounds, but not completely. The muted banging continued, now distant and distorted through brick. Elena lifted the emergency lamp from its hook and held it ahead. The passage was barely wide enough for 2 people. Moisture glimmered on the walls. It smelled of earth and old secrets. Marco took the lead now, gun raised, shoulders tight. Victor stumbled behind him, one hand pressed to his wound. Elena followed, phone in her pocket vibrating softly as the countdown fell. 7 minutes had become 4. The tunnel bent sharply left, then descended. Her shoes slipped on damp stone. "Where does this come out?" she whispered. "Carriage house," Marco said. "Across the alley." Victor shook his head. "Too obvious." Marco didn't slow. "It's what we have." Elena watched the back of her brother's neck, the set of his shoulders, and suddenly a memory rose with such force it almost stole her footing. She was 12. Rain hammered the windows of their childhood study. Their father sat at the desk with the ledger open, though she had not known what it was then. Marco stood near the door, 14, and trying to look older. Their father had been furious about something, but his anger never came loudly. That was what made it worse. He tapped one finger on a name written in black ink and said, "A man is useful only when he understands which truth belongs to him and which truth belongs to the family." Elena remembered laughing from the rug because the sentence sounded theatrical. Their father's eyes cut to her with ice-cold disappointment. "And innocence," he had said, "is only valuable until it starts asking questions." The memory vanished as she almost collided with Marco, who had stopped. Ahead, the tunnel widened into a chamber with 2 branching exits. One had collapsed under old brick and earth. The other remained open but narrow. Marco cursed under his breath. "The left route is gone." Victor leaned against the wall, struggling to remain upright. Then, "The right leads under the alley, and into the boiler room." Elena looked between them. "Of the carriage house?" Victor nodded. "Of the old municipal records, building next to it." Marco turned sharply. "How do you know this tunnel better than I do?" Victor gave him a look filled with old contempt. "Because your father showed it to people he trusted." The implication struck like a slap. Marco actually flinched. Elena saw it in profile, quick and humiliating. The phone in her pocket vibrated again. She pulled it out. 1 minute 38 seconds. "Enough," she said. "He makes the call now." Marco looked ready to argue, then heard the same distant muffled noises behind them, the methodical progress of men searching stone and timber for a way through. He held out his hand. "Put it on, speaker." Elena gave Victor the phone. He tapped once, and the line rang immediately. A woman answered on the second ring. No greeting, no hesitation. "Status." Victor took one breath. "Delayed, not dead." The woman was silent for half a second. "Verification." Victor looked at Elena. "Tell her the phrase on the note." Elena unfolded the paper with shaking fingers and read the handwritten line at the bottom, almost hidden in the fold. Winterfields remember. Another pause. Then the woman on the line said, "Timer cancelled. New condition." Victor closed his eyes briefly, as if he had expected that. "Say it. We don't trust your containment anymore. Transfer requires the daughter." Elena felt the tunnel narrow around her. "No," Marco said instantly. The woman continued as though she had not heard him. "Elena De Luca must deliver the index and confirm the ledger location in person. 12 noon tomorrow. St. Bartholomew Ferry Terminal. Lower dock. Come alone, or everything disperses." Elena spoke before anyone could stop her. "Who are you?" The voice remained cool. "Someone who kept your father's enemies from becoming your inheritance. Do not test whether that courtesy extends to you." The line disconnected. For several seconds nobody moved. Marco's expression was unreadable in the dim light. Victor leaned his head back against the wall, exhausted. "Well," he said softly, "now we know who still owns the board." Elena stared at the blank phone screen. Her name had moved from the edge of this story to the center in one sentence. She could feel it. The click of unseen machinery aligning around her. "You knew this could happen," she said to Victor. "I knew there was a chance they'd ask for leverage." "Leverage?" Marco's voice shook with rage now. "She is not leverage." Victor looked at him with something close to pity. "To them, everyone is leverage. The difference is whether you admit it before or after they use you." Marco stepped forward as if to hit him, then stopped when Elena moved between them. "Enough," she said. Her own voice surprised her. It was steadier than she felt. "We get out first, then you tell me everything. No more edited versions, no more protection. Everything." Marco looked at her for a long second, and in that second she saw him realizing he had already lost the right to refuse. He nodded once. Somewhere behind them, faint but undeniable, came the deep grinding vibration of stone shifting against metal. The men behind the wall had found the mechanism, or they were blowing through it. Either way, the tunnel no longer felt like escape. It felt like borrowed time. Marco turned toward the open branch. "Move." They pushed deeper into the passage. One lamp, one gun, one wounded man, and one truth after another collapsing behind them, until the darkness ahead began to smell not of earth but of old paper, dust, and river damp, and Elena understood with a rising, terrible clarity that whatever waited at the end of this tunnel would not be a way back to her old life, only the first room in the wreckage of the next one. Marco stopped so abruptly that Elena nearly ran into him again, and this time it was not because the passage narrowed, but because a faint glow had appeared ahead through a rusted grate. It was not daylight. It was the weak amber pulse of an old maintenance bulb, swinging somewhere beyond the wall, making shadows breathe in and out over brick, slick with moisture. The tunnel opened into a cramped utility corridor, lined with pipes wrapped in fraying insulation. Water dripped steadily from a cracked valve into a shallow puddle that reflected the lamp in broken pieces. Marco lifted a hand for silence. Even Victor managed to steady his breathing. Above them, muted through layers of stone and timber, came the groan of the city in its sleeping hours. A truck shifting gears on the avenue, a distant siren, the low churn of the river beyond the old municipal buildings. The ordinary life of the city continued while 3 people bled and lied beneath it. Elena found that fact almost offensive. "Which way?" she whispered. Marco pointed toward a steel service door at the end of the corridor. A faded stencil on the wall read "Boiler Access" in flaking black paint. Victor stared at it as if seeing a ghost. "I haven't been here in 12 years, he murmured. Marco looked back. "You came here with him." It wasn't a question. Victor's eyes moved to Marco's face, and for the first time since the shooting, there was no mockery in them. Only an old weariness. "Twice," he said. Elena noticed how Marco's jaw tightened, how the old wound inside him sharpened at every new proof that their father had built secret trust with other men, while teaching his own son to stand outside the door and wait. She stored the observation away, not out of cruelty, but because tonight, every buried thing was turning into motive. Marco tested the service door. Locked. He crouched, checked the hinges, then aimed the gun and hesitated. "Too loud," Elena said. "We've already had louder," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Victor reached weakly into his pocket and produced a thin strip of metal attached to a key ring. "Use this." Marco stared at the pics in disbelief. "Is there anything about you that isn't rehearsed?" Victor leaned against the wall. "Pain. This is very current." Marco snatched the pics and bent to the lock. Elena watched his fingers. He was shaking, but not from fear alone. Adrenaline had started to thin. The body always sent its bill. While he worked, she studied Victor under the dim light. Blood had dried dark down his side. His skin had the waxy color of a candle burned too long. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly. Victor glanced at the wound, then at her. "If you want honesty, bad enough to matter, not bad enough to simplify anything." The answer annoyed her, because it was clever, and because it was true. She tore a strip from the lining of an old tarp hanging nearby and tightened the makeshift bandage at his shoulder. Victor inhaled sharply but didn't complain. "Why me?" she asked without preamble. On the phone. Why did she ask for me? Victor's gaze sharpened despite the pain. "Because your name still opens old doors. Because men who hated your father will believe you before they believe Marco. Because if they can make you carry it, they can watch what kind of person inherits his debt." Elena let that settle. In her chest, fear and anger had begun blending into something more disciplined. It frightened her more than panic had. The lock clicked. Marco opened the service door a few inches and listened. No immediate voices. He pushed it wider. Beyond it lay a boiler room the size of a church nave, abandoned but not dead, with hulking iron tanks, catwalks overhead, and rows of filing cabinets shoved against the far wall as if paper and machinery had once shared the same grave. The amber bulb hung from a chain over a central work table. Everything smelled of rust, oil, river damp, and mold softened by time. Elena stepped through and immediately felt the strange calm of institutional spaces emptied after disaster. This place had once held records, heat, labor, purpose. Now it held only residue. Marco shut the service door behind them without bolting it. "If they found the tunnel," he said, "this won't stop them." Victor scanned the room. "There used to be an exterior loading door on the north side." Marco nodded. "Which is exactly where they'll expect us to go." Elena walked toward the filing cabinets, almost without thinking. Labels curled from old drawers. Procurement, sanitation, transit claims, civil works. The mundane skeleton of government. She imagined their father using this dead building as a second bloodstream beneath the city, passing secrets through rooms nobody important ever noticed. "You said father. Split the archive," she said. "Ledger and index. What exactly is the index?" Victor sank onto a low stool with a groan. "Cross-reference key. Real names matched to aliases, shell structures, dates, side payments, off-book obligations. The ledger alone tells you crimes happened. The index tells you whose hands stayed clean on paper." Marco gave a bitter laugh. "So father made sure even his own blackmail had backup blackmail." "Your father understood survival as architecture," Victor said. "He never built one exit when he could build 5 and mine 3 of them." Elena opened one drawer at random and found it empty except for a dead moth and a crumbling ledger tab from another decade. The word ledger hit her again in a new way. Not just the object, the concept. Record as weapon, memory as trap. What was he protecting? She asked. Himself? Victor watched her carefully. At first, influence, money, protection from prosecution. Then later, maybe something less selfish. Marco scoffed. You still want to rescue him? No, Victor said. I want to be accurate. He became frightened near the end. Elena turned. Frightened of what? Victor looked past her, toward nothing visible. That he had finally lost track of which monsters were his. The statement brought back another memory, uninvited and precise. Elena was 19, home from her first year away. She had gone to their father's study late at night to look for a fountain pen she liked. He had been alone in the dark, sitting by the window without lights on, a whiskey untouched in his hand. She had almost backed out quietly, but he had said, "Do you ever wonder if guilt has a shape?" She had laughed nervously, thinking it one more of his theatrical riddles. You mean metaphorically? He had turned to her then, and for one rare second he looked not powerful but hunted. No, he said. I mean, if you saw it standing in a doorway, would you know it was yours? She had never told Marco about that moment. She had dismissed it as fatigue, or drink, or age. Now, in the boiler room, with her father's world grinding open around her, she wondered what had already been coming for him back then. A metallic clank echoed from somewhere above. All three of them looked up. Footsteps crossed a catwalk overhead, faint, but real. Marco raised the gun. Elena lowered his arm slightly. Could be old expansion. Another clank. Then a brief cone of light swept through the gaps in the rusted grating above. Not expansion. Search. Marco swore under his breath. They're in the building. Victor shut his eyes for a moment, as if calculating. Then they either lost time in the tunnel, or they had a second team ahead of us. How comforting, Elena said. Marco pointed to the rows of cabinets. Get behind those. They moved quickly, dragging Victor into the narrow space between two rusted ranks of files. From there, Elena could see slivers of the room through drawer handles and bent metal. A beam of flashlight moved across the boiler tanks, then the floor, then the hanging work table. Two men crossed the catwalk overhead, silhouettes only, speaking too softly to make out. They kept moving toward the far stair. Elena realized with cold certainty that Matteo was her father's kind of man, patient enough to send teams not for attack, but for containment, sealing exits, until fear made the people inside choose the path he wanted. The catwalk door slammed somewhere beyond sight. Silence fell again. Victor leaned close to Elena and whispered, "There may be another way out, through the archive lift." "Maybe? I haven't tested memory under blood loss lately." Marco peered through the gap. "Where?" "South wall, behind the old heat exchangers. Hidden service platform used for document transfer." Marco looked unconvinced but had no better option. "Stay here," he said. "I'll check." Elena caught his sleeve. "No splitting up." He met her eyes. "If I don't check, we wait for them to corner us. And if you go alone, you vanish into another decision I never get to see." That struck more deeply than she intended. Marco's face changed, softened by something like shame. Before he could answer, a new voice rolled down from the darkness beyond the boilers. Not Matteo this time. Younger, tighter. "This place always smelled like wet ash." Elena's pulse jumped. Victor had gone very still. A second figure stepped into the pool of amber light by the table. A woman in a dark coat, hair pinned back, one hand tucked in her pocket, the other holding a flashlight at her side. She looked around not like a soldier clearing a room, but like someone revisiting a childhood house after a funeral. "Victor," she said, not loudly. "I know you're here." Victor muttered a curse under his breath that Elena did not catch. Marco's hand tightened on the gun. Elena studied the woman through the gap. She was perhaps 40, maybe older. The kind of face age did not soften, but sharpened, composed, almost elegant, except for the deep fatigue beneath the eyes. "Who is that?" Elena whispered. Victor took too long to answer. "Lucia Varela." Marco looked sharply toward him. "The prosecutor's daughter?" Victor gave a tiny nod. Elena felt the name strike somewhere dim in memory. Varela. She had heard it in whispers after their father's death, then never again. "I thought her father killed himself," she whispered. Victor's mouth thinned. "That's the public version." Lucia moved slowly around the table, setting her flashlight down. "Matteo enjoys his theater," she said to the room. "I don't. If you're hiding, understand this before he reaches you. He wants the ledger intact. I want names confirmed. That difference matters to your survival." Marco frowned. "She's not with him?" Victor's answer was bleak. "Not exactly." Lucia stepped closer to the cabinets without seeming hurried. "Victor, you once told me loyalty was just grief with better posture. I should have known then you would eventually choose the side most likely to survive." Victor's eyes closed for an instant. "You didn't come for philosophy, Lucia." "No. I came because the dead still haven't finished billing the living." Elena watched Victor's face in profile and saw, to her surprise, not fear but regret. Personal regret. Not strategic, not abstract. The room shifted under that realization. Lucia wasn't just another player. She was part of the same old wound. Marco must have seen it too, because he looked at Victor with new suspicion. Elena whispered, "What did you do to her?" Victor let out a slow breath. "Not enough. Too late." The answer made Marco almost laugh. "Remarkable. Even your remorse sounds evasive." Lucia had reached the cabinet row now. "If Elena De Luca is with you," she said, "you should know I asked for her at noon because she still has a chance to decide what this becomes. Marco does not. You do not. She does." Elena felt her throat tighten. There was something unbearable in hearing strangers discuss her future, as if they had already measured it better than she had. Yet beneath the anger, another sensation emerged, a terrible curiosity. "Why me?" she called out, before Marco could stop her. The room froze. Lucia turned toward the sound but did not rush. "Because your father destroyed my family," she said, "but he also spared yours when he could have used you both as collateral. That contradiction has bothered me for 11 years. Marco started to move, but Elena held him back. "So this is revenge?" Lucia's face did not change. "No. Revenge is simple. This is accounting." Elena rose from behind the cabinet before either man could stop her. Marco hissed her name, but she stepped into the open aisle with the lamp held low. Lucia looked at her steadily. For a long moment, neither spoke. Elena saw immediately that Lucia's composure was not natural. It was built, reinforced, paid for over years. "My father knew yours," Elena said. Lucia gave a single nod. "My father tried to expose a procurement network laundering disappearances through infrastructure contracts." Your father convinced him to bury it. When he refused, the case collapsed, witnesses vanished, and 6 months later, my father was found with a note in his study. Everyone called it shame. It was fear. Victor spoke from the shadows. Lucia. She didn't look toward him. You don't get to interrupt the version that finally includes me. Elena felt Marco shift behind the cabinets, torn between protecting her and listening. And Victor? Elena asked. Lucia's jaw tightened slightly. Victor promised to help me prove what happened. Instead, he disappeared, with the only map that could have done it. Victor stepped out then, one hand against his wound, his face pale and drawn, but no longer hidden. I disappeared because 3 men who worked for your father were already dead, and Matteo was preparing a 4th body. Lucia laughed once, bitterly. There it is, the noble cowardice. I kept you alive. You kept me uninformed. Her voice finally cracked on the last word, the first real fracture in her control. The sound changed the room more than shouting could have. Elena saw suddenly that this was not merely an argument about evidence. It was about abandonment, about who had been allowed to carry pain alone so someone else could call it protection. The pattern was so familiar it made her feel briefly sick. Marco emerged now as well, still armed. Lucia's eyes flicked to the gun, then to his face. You look more like him than she does, she said. Marco answered without warmth. I've been hearing that all night. Lucia's gaze sharpened. That should concern you. Above them, from somewhere deeper in the building, a heavy door slammed, then a distant shout. Matteo's men were still searching. Lucia heard it and checked her watch. We don't have long. Marco took a step closer, then talked fast. Are you with Matteo or against him? Lucia considered the question with open contempt. Matteo believes the ledger is still a marketplace. He wants to resell fear to the people named in it and rebuild his influence from their panic. I want the structure exposed in a way that cannot be reburied by one more discreet death, Victor said, quietly, by dragging Elena into it. Lucia finally looked at him. The old feeling between them flashed once. Hurt sharpened into anger because it had once been something else. You dragged her in when you failed to end this before it reached her generation. Elena watched that land on Victor. He did not defend himself. For the first time, she wondered whether the young version of Victor had truly tried to help Lucia once, and whether that failure was one of the reasons he had stayed chained to her father's ghost for so long. Marco lowered the gun slightly, not from trust but because the shape of the problem had changed again. If Matteo gets here first, he asked, then he'll take whichever of us can still be traded, Lucia said. He'll kill whichever of us cannot. Elena's thoughts moved quickly now. Noon tomorrow, ferry terminal, index, ledger location, too many forces converging. She looked at Lucia. If I meet you, what guarantees do I have? Lucia's expression almost softened, though not kindly. None. That is what adulthood turns into around men like your father. Victor let out a tired sound somewhere between a laugh and a cough. Finally, something honest. Lucia ignored him. But I can give you facts. The package that almost released tonight was not enough to convict anyone of consequence. It was a trigger, not an endgame. The index is the real spine. Without it, the people above your father remain rumor. With it, they become accountable if the release is structured correctly. Marco's head snapped toward Victor. You were never going to expose them. You were only threatening movement. Victor met his gaze. Movement keeps you alive long enough to choose when to cut. Marco's face darkened with disgust. So everyone here is managing terror like an investment portfolio. Elena felt the anger between them turning circular, useless. Stop, she said. Both men did. Lucia watched her with that same infuriating calm, as if noting the exact second Elena began using command instead of reaction. The bank, Elena said. The safe deposit box. Can we get to it before noon? Lucia's eyes narrowed. So, there is a box, Marco muttered. Careful. Too late. Elena already understood that caution had become another form of delay. Can we? She repeated. Lucia answered honestly enough to alarm her, not without attention. Bellwether Trust moved its private archives after the antitrust raids last year. Access is tighter. Off-hours entry would announce us. Daylight entry would expose you, Victor added. And if Matteo has watchers on the old routes, he'll predict the bank the moment he learns we're heading there. Elena paced once across the narrow aisle, mind racing. Every path seemed designed to force compromise. Save the evidence, lose anonymity. Save her brother, lose the chance to expose anything. Save herself, leave the cities dead, buried under one more generation of careful silence. The boiler room seemed to press inward with each option. She remembered being 16, and watching Marco break a boy's nose outside school because the boy had mocked their father's funeral. Marco had come home with split knuckles and eyes bright with shame. It solved nothing, Elena had told him while cleaning the blood from his hand. Marco had stared at the sink and said, "Sometimes solving isn't available. Sometimes you just choose which thing hurts and who you can still look at after." She had forgotten the sentence until now. Or perhaps she had refused to remember it because it made him sound older than either of them had deserved to be. A sharp crack echoed from the service corridor behind them. The door they had come through shook once under impact. Matteo's men had found the way in. Lucia turned immediately toward the south wall. "Archive lift," she said. "Now." Marco raised the gun again. "How do I know you're not walking us into them?" Lucia met his stare without blinking. "You don't. That's what trust looks like after corruption. It stops being pure and starts becoming timed." The door cracked again, metal bending in its frame. Victor forced himself upright with a groan. Elena stepped beside Lucia, not behind her, which Lucia seemed to notice. Together, they moved around the heat exchangers to a caged platform hidden behind hanging tarps and collapsed shelving. A chain hoist and manual lever assembly were bolted beside it. The lift looked ancient, a freight platform for boxes and archive trunks, not people. Marco shoved debris aside while Lucia worked the brake release. "It still runs?" Elena asked. Lucia replied without looking up. "It runs enough." The service door burst open across the room. Flashlights cut through the dark. Voices shouted. Marco fired once, then twice, driving them behind cover. Victor stumbled onto the platform. Elena climbed on after him. Lucia hauled the gate shut. Marco backed toward them, firing again, each shot louder in the confined room than the last. A bullet struck metal near the hoist with a deafening clang. Lucia yanked the lever. For a sickening second, nothing happened. Then the platform jerked upward violently, chains screaming under strain. Marco leapt the narrowing gap just as the platform rose clear of the floor. A bullet tore through the edge of his coat. Below them, men surged toward the lift shaft. Matteo himself stepped into the light at last, face upturned, elegant even in pursuit. He did not shout. He simply watched them rise with the look of a man memorizing unfinished business. Elena met his gaze for one terrible second. His expression held no rage at all, only recognition, as if he had been expecting her for years and had merely waited for the proper age. The lift shuddered higher into darkness, carrying them toward whatever waited above. While below, Matteo's voice floated up calm as prayer. "Elena, ask your brother what happened to Tomas Varela before you decide whose version of guilt you're carrying." The words struck Lucia like a physical blow. She grabbed the cage so hard her knuckles whitened. Marco looked at her, then at Victor, and in the dim shaft light, Elena saw the next fracture opening, deeper than the others, because this one was not about hidden money or leverage or tactics. It was about a dead man, and whichever of the living had lied most persuasively about him. It was about a dead man, and whichever of the living had lied most persuasively about him. The lift rattled upward through black iron ribs and old concrete, each jolt threatening to throw Victor back against the cage, but nobody reached to steady him, because every pair of eyes had been seized by Matteo's final sentence. Lucia stood frozen, one hand still locked around the metal gate. All the color drained from her face. Marco's breathing had changed. Elena heard it, even over the shriek of chains. It was no longer the breath of a man escaping. It was the breath of a man who had just seen a buried door in himself swing open. "What did he mean?" Elena asked. But the question fell into a silence so tight, it almost felt solid. The lift lurched again, climbed another few feet, and finally scraped to a halt at the top of the shaft with a shower of rust. Lucia moved first. She forced the gate back and stepped into a dark archive room filled with dust-sheeted shelves and broken microfilm cabinets. Rain tapped somewhere overhead. A single cracked skylight let in a smear of streetlight from the river. Marco stayed on the platform. "Answer her," he said to Victor without looking at him. Victor climbed off more slowly, one hand pressed to his shoulder, and his face had taken on the exhausted resignation of a man who knows the truth will not save him, only change the order of damage. Elena came last, stepping into a room that smelled of mildew, paper glue, and the slow rot of forgotten institutions. She looked from Lucia to Victor, then to Marco. "Now," she said. Marco still did not meet her eyes. He was looking at Lucia instead, and the look held something Elena had almost never seen in her brother. Not anger, not guilt. Fear of deserving the answer. Lucia folded her arms tightly across herself, as if physically containing whatever Matteo had torn open. "Tomas Varela was my brother," she said. Her voice was controlled again, but too controlled. "Not my father. My brother was 24. He worked under my father on the procurement case because he still believed public service was more than paperwork. 2 weeks before he vanished, He told me there was a witness list someone inside the mayor's office wanted altered. He said if anything happened to him, I should look at DeLuca transit contracts and a customs route through Port Sable. Elena felt the pieces rearrange inside her. He vanished? Lucia's gaze shifted to Marco. Officially, yes. Unofficially, we were told his body washed up in a flood, Channel 3 districts south. But by then, every identifying report had already been signed by people connected to your father. Marco finally spoke, voice low and rough. I didn't kill him. Lucia let out a breath that might once have been laughter. Interesting that you answered the accusation I didn't make. Victor closed his eyes briefly. Elena turned to him. You know what happened. Some of it, he said. Not enough at the time. Enough now to hate the timing of Mateo's mouth. Marco stepped closer, the old violence back in his posture, but wearier now, less certain of itself. Say it clearly. Victor looked at him for a long second. Tomas took copies of shipping manifests tied to 3 shell firms. One of them traced back to an account your father used for off-book enforcement. Enforcement, Elena repeated, as if saying the polished word might make it less obscene. Victor nodded once. Tomas planned to hand the manifests to a judge outside the city. Someone found out. The handoff never happened. Lucia's eyes remained on Marco. And where were you in all that? Marco's mouth tightened. Elena saw the answer arrive in him before he spoke it. With my father. Lucia's stare did not shift. Doing what? Marco swallowed. The movement looked painful. Driving. The word sat in the air like a verdict. Elena stared at him. The room seemed to tilt very slightly under her feet. Driving where? She asked. Marco looked at the floor. Warehouse District. Port Sable Road. Father got a call and told me to take him. Lucia's voice was almost gentle now, which made it worse. Did you know who he was going to meet? No. Did you ask? Marco's silence was answer enough. Elena felt a heat rise under her skin that had nothing to do with the close air of the archive room. Not because she thought Marco had murdered anyone with his own hands, but because she could suddenly see how many horrors enter a life through small obediences. Driving, waiting outside, not asking, letting power keep its shape because naming it would make you responsible. Marco spoke again, but it was to Elena now, not Lucia. I was 19. So was Tomas, Lucia said. Marco flinched as if struck. Victor watched them both with the hollow look of a man who has seen this collision coming for years and still failed to prevent it. Elena remembered another night from that same year, long before their father died. Marco had come home with mud on his shoes and a split lip. He had sat at the kitchen table in the dark, refusing to turn on the light. When Elena asked what happened, he said, I drove somewhere I shouldn't have. She had laughed, thinking he meant a girl's house or a fight, or some ordinary teenage wreckage. She had fetched ice and left him alone because he looked humiliated, and boys their age treated humiliation as mortal injury. The memory arrived now with unbearable precision, and she wanted to go back through time, take his face in both hands, and force the truth out of him before it calcified into adulthood. Lucia spoke into the silence. My brother called me that night from a payphone. He said if I didn't hear from him by morning, I should tell our father that he'd found the son with the car. I never knew what that meant. Marco's head lifted slowly. His face had gone pale in a way Elena had never seen. He saw me. Lucia's expression hardened. Yes, he saw you. Not giving orders, not carrying a weapon, but there. Marco backed away a step and hit an old cabinet. Dust shook loose. Elena watched him with a complicated ache that felt almost impossible to survive. She loved him. That had not changed. But love was no longer a simple bridge across facts. It had become something heavier, uglier, a structure that had to hold under the truth instead of above it. What happened after you drove your father there? She asked. Marco shook his head once, almost violently, as if trying to clear sound from his ears. He told me to wait in the car, Lucia said. Did you? Another silence. Then Marco answered, for a while. Victor straightened slightly despite the pain. Marco. Marco ignored him. He was staring not at any of them now, but at some point far past the wall. There was shouting in the warehouse. I heard my father and another voice. I went in through the side door. Elena could see it as he spoke, the scene forming not because she wanted it but because memory in Marco's face made it vivid. A younger version of him, frightened and eager, not yet cruel, but already trained to obey power before he understood it. Tomas was there, Marco said, and 2 men I didn't know. Father was trying to talk him down. At least that's what I thought. Tomas kept saying there were copies, that it didn't matter if they took the originals. He kept looking at me. Lucia's eyes glittered, but she said nothing. Marco continued, voice thick now. He knew I was the son. He said, ask him what he's protecting. I told him to calm down. I told him nobody had to get hurt. He laughed once then, a hideous sound with no humor in it. Like I had any authority in that room. Elena felt her chest hurt. Then what? Marco's hands had started to shake. He hid them by curling them into fists. One of the men grabbed him. Tomas fought back. Father shouted, "There was a gun." "Whose?" Lucia asked. "I don't know. It happened too fast." Marco pressed a hand to his forehead. "I remember Tomas lunging for the manifests. I remember my father shouting my name. I remember a shot. Then Tomas fell." Lucia closed her eyes, but only for a second. "And?" Marco's voice lowered. "And my father told me to leave. Nobody moved. Even the rain outside seemed to recede." Elena heard her own breathing and hated it. "Did you?" she asked. Marco looked at her then, and his face broke in a way she had never seen. Not tears. Something older and more terrible. "Yes." The word was small, but it filled the room. Lucia inhaled sharply through her nose. Victor looked away. Elena felt the floor vanish under every version of her brother she had preserved over the years. 19. Scared. Complicit. Not the hand that fired, perhaps, but the witness who left. The son with the car. She wanted to rage at him, shake him, ask how he could carry this and still stand near her as though protection had not always also been contamination. Instead, she asked the only question that seemed to matter. "Was Tomas alive when you left?" Marco's lips parted, but no answer came. Elena stepped closer. "Marco." He shut his eyes. "I don't know." Lucia turned away then, one hand braced against a shelf. For the first time, the composure actually failed. Her shoulders shook once. She made no sound. That silence hurt more than any sob could have. Victor spoke into it, quiet and strained. "I learned years later that the medical report was altered. Tomas had a survivable wound at first. The fatal injury came later." Lucia looked back at him sharply. All grief instantly sharpened into fury. "You knew this and said nothing." "I knew the report was false. I didn't know who finished it." "Convenient." "No," Victor said. "Cowardly." Elena saw something pass between them then, an old intimacy made poisonous by omission. Lucia's mouth tightened. "Matteo thinks Marco knows more than he has admitted," she said. "That is why he kept him alive all these years." Marco stared at her. "I don't." Lucia gave a thin, merciless shrug. Perhaps not consciously. Trauma is very useful to men like Matteo. It blurs the line between witness and accomplice until you start policing your own memory for them. The sentence landed with terrible elegance because Elena knew it was true in more ways than one. Marco had spent a decade trying to bury evidence, making deals, weaponizing secrecy, all while telling himself he was preventing chaos. Maybe he had been protecting the city from exposure. Maybe he had also been protecting himself from one warehouse floor and one unanswered question. An old building groaned around them. Somewhere below, metal banged against metal. Matteo's team was moving upward through the structure. Lucia checked the dark window, then her watch. "We have perhaps 20 minutes before they secure the exterior and start clearing room by room." Elena almost laughed at the brutality of time, how it never paused for revelation. Marco looked as though he might collapse or start shooting, or both. Victor leaned against a shelf, visibly fading. The next choice was waiting, indifferent to their pain. Elena made herself think. "If Matteo believes Marco remembers something crucial," she said, "then keeping Marco is more valuable to him than killing him immediately." Lucia nodded. "Likely." "And if Matteo wants the ledger intact, he still needs the index." "Yes." Elena turned to Marco. "Then he expects us to go to the bank." Marco rubbed a hand over his face. "It's the obvious move," Victor said. "Which means it's the wrong one, unless we want his people waiting outside every entrance." Lucia glanced at Elena. "Not necessarily. The obvious move is still usable if the right person walks in." Elena understood before anyone said it. "Me." Marco answered instantly. "No." She ignored him. "If I go in alone, Matteo may let it happen because he still wants noon at the ferry." Lucia nodded once. "And Bellwether's private clients knew your father's face, not yours. There are still photographs in old donor boards. The resemblance may be enough to open courtesy before scrutiny." Marco took a step toward them, anger rising again because anger was easier than shame. "You're both talking about her like bait." Elena rounded on him. "And what have you been doing for 10 years except deciding what risks I'm allowed to know about?" He went still. She kept going because if she stopped, the grief under the anger would reach her too fast. "You lied to me about the ledger. You lied about father. You lied by omission about Tomas Varela. You stood next to me at birthdays and funerals and ordinary Sundays carrying all of this. And every time I trusted you, I was trusting a version of you you curated. Marco's face folded inward, but she could not stop now. So don't you dare suddenly discover moral clarity when I choose a danger you didn't authorize. Lucia looked away, almost respectfully. Victor said nothing. Marco's reply came slowly. I didn't curate it to control you. Elena's laugh was sharp. Then what do you call it? He met her eyes at last. I called it love because I didn't know what else to do with the guilt. The honesty of it nearly undid her. That was the cruelest thing about truth. Sometimes it exposed manipulation, and sometimes it exposed the wounded child inside the manipulator at the same time, leaving you with no clean target for your rage. Elena felt tears threaten and refused them. Not now. Love is not a vault, she said. Not anymore. Marco looked down. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller than she had heard since they were young. Then tell me what to do. The question transformed the room. For the first time all night, he was not asserting. He was yielding. Not passively, desperately. Elena had wanted that for years without knowing she wanted it. But standing in front of him now, she discovered it brought no triumph, only weight. She turned to Lucia. Suppose I get the index. Then what? Lucia answered carefully. And Elena respected that more than certainty. Then we verify the ledger against it. We create copies in multiple jurisdictions, not one. We release pieces in a sequence that makes suppression harder and retaliation visible. And we identify who, among the people still in office, can survive being named without collapsing the case. Victor gave a faint, tired smile. You became the very thing your father would have feared most. Methodical. Lucia's eyes cut to him. You say that as if it pleases you. Victor did not answer. Elena noticed the way Lucia still measured him despite herself. Old love never truly vanished in this city, she thought. It just learned how to wear legal language and contempt. Another metallic crash rose from below, closer now. Marco turned toward the door. We need movement. Elena nodded. We split. No, Marco said immediately, and then caught himself, hearing the old reflex in his own voice. He closed his eyes briefly. Tell me the plan. She drew a slow breath. Lucia and I go to Bellwether at opening. Public entrance. No weapons. No Victor. Victor let out a dry sound. I feel valued. You'll be dead by then, if we drag you through public security. Elena said. You need treatment, and you know faces who can provide it without calling Matteo. Victor wanted to argue, then looked at the blood on his own hand, and seemed to decide reality had made the point for her. Maybe two, he said. One is compromised. The other owes me. Marco asked. And me? Elena held his gaze. This part hurt most. You don't come with us. He stared. You think I'll slow you down? I think Matteo's people know your face better than mine. I think if they see you, they close in. I think if Lucia walks in with me, we look like professionals. If you walk in with us, we look like a fleeing family. Lucia added, not unkindly. And if Matteo still believes you may remember something from Tomas's death, he'll prioritize tailing you over Elena. That may be useful. Marco gave a bitter, exhausted smile. So I get to become the distraction. Elena answered softly. You get to choose it this time. The words landed between them with a complexity. Neither could survive unpacking right now. Marco nodded once. It cost him visibly. Fine. Victor pushed off the shelf, grimacing. I can get to Dr. Soren, Markta. He stitched worse men in quieter wars. Lucia looked skeptical. If Soren is still alive. Victor almost smiled. He is. He'll outlive principle itself. Elena took the brass key from her pocket and held it up. It flashed faintly in the skylight leak. Such a small thing to carry this much consequence. Then we move before dawn. She looked at Lucia. You and I leave separately and meet 3 blocks from Bellwether. No phones after we exit this building. Lucia nodded. Agreed. Marco stepped closer, lower voice now. Elena. She turned. For a second, he seemed about to say something expansive, apologetic, maybe even redeeming. But what came out instead was simple and almost unbearably human. I am sorry I left him there. Lucia's eyes shut at the sentence. When she opened them, she looked at Marco not with forgiveness, but with full recognition of his damage. I know, she said. That is part of why this is tragic instead of easy. Marco absorbed that like a wound he had expected and still could not bear. Elena thought suddenly of all the stories people told about evil to keep from seeing the pathetic anatomy of it. Cowardice, loyalty, hunger for approval, the terrified hope that someone more powerful would make your choices meaningful. Her father had ruled with those materials because they were common, because they lived in almost everyone. Another shout sounded from the hall beyond the archive room. Flashlight beams flickered under the door. Lucia straightened immediately. We go now. There was a narrow stair at the rear of the archives, half hidden by map drawers and collapsed cartons. They moved toward it quickly, Victor slower than the rest, leaving tiny, dark flecks of blood on the dusty floor. Elena caught Marco glancing once at those drops, and she knew he was counting again, always counting cost, as though arithmetic could someday become absolution. The stair led upward into a disused records office on the top floor, where rain leaked through broken plaster and old desks sat under tarps like abandoned furniture in a condemned church. Dawn had not arrived yet, but the eastern windows held that thin blue pre-light, which makes every object look colder than it is. The river beyond the glass was a black stripe between warehouses. In the distance, church bells began striking 5, each note slow and hollow across the water. Morning was coming, whether they deserved it or not. Lucia stopped near the shattered window and studied the alley below. 2 men, at the rear entrance, she said. 1 car on the corner, idling. Marco joined her. Matteo closes gently. Victor, leaning against a desk, said, he likes people to feel they walked into their own capture. Elena scanned the room until she found an old municipal fire escape plan framed crookedly on the wall. Most of the marked routes were useless now, but one external maintenance bridge connected this building to the adjacent print annex 2 floors down. From there, a separate stairwell could lead to the river street. She pointed. There. Lucia came beside her, followed her finger, and nodded. If the bridge still holds. Marco looked at the ancient blueprint, and then at the gap between buildings beyond the window. If it doesn't, the river gets one more family scandal. Even exhausted, even cracked open by guilt, he still had the reflex to make pain smaller with ugliness. Elena almost smiled, and hated that too. They made their way down another corridor, stepping around wet plaster and fallen ceiling lath, until they reached a steel door hanging half off its hinges. Beyond it, the maintenance bridge stretched across open air, a narrow, graded walkway slick with rain, hanging above an alley full of shadow and dumpsters. Wind came off the river, sharp enough to sting. Lucia went first, testing each step. The bridge groaned but held. Marco followed Victor across while Elena came last. Halfway over, she looked down and saw the idling car at the corner more clearly now. Its windshield black, its patience monstrous. This was the hour when cleaners unlocked cafes and bakers dragged trays from ovens and newspaper trucks rolled through empty intersections. The city was waking into itself while they crossed between decaying government buildings, carrying evidence of a generation's corruption in one small brass key and several shattered loyalties. By the time they reached the annex stairwell, Elena understood, with a calm so complete it almost frightened her, that the next hours would decide not only what happened to the ledger, but which version of everyone around her would survive exposure. By the time they reached the annex stairwell, Elena understood with a calm so complete it almost frightened her that the next hours would decide not only what happened to the ledger, but which version of everyone around her would survive exposure. The stairwell smelled of wet concrete and printer's ink long soaked into the walls. Dawn seeped through a wired glass door at the bottom landing, turning the dust in the air silver. Lucia paused there and listened. No footsteps, no voices, only the dull slap of rainwater dripping from the gutter outside. This is where we divide, she said. Victor gave a faint nod, already leaning too heavily on the banister. Marco looked at Elena as if trying to memorize something before losing the right to ask for it back. She hated the tenderness in that look because it was real, and because real tenderness had not kept him from lying to her for years. 3 blocks east of Bellwether, Lucia said to Elena, corner of Finch and Mercer. 9:10. Elena nodded. And if you're followed? Then I do not appear. Victor pushed himself upright. I'll get to Soren through the old tram depot. Marco glanced toward him. You can barely stand. Then I'll do it while seated in intervals. Marco almost smiled despite everything, then didn't. They stepped out into the alley one by one. The city at 5 in the morning seemed made of washed stone and withheld judgment. Trucks hissed through wet intersections. A bakery light glowed 2 streets over. Somewhere a radio played softly behind a shutter. Life, indifferent and intact, kept happening around the edges of catastrophe. Lucia moved north without looking back. Victor turned west, shoulders bent against pain. Marco and Elena stood for one suspended second under the dripping awning of the annex. Brother and sister reduced at last to the difficult scale of 2 human beings instead of the roles they had hidden inside. You should go, Elena said. Marco did not move. Not until I know you're clear. You don't get to supervise me out of guilt. I know. He swallowed. That wasn't what this was. She looked at him carefully. Dawn made him look older than he was, not because of the lines in his face, but because the effort of carrying too much in silence had finally become visible in the posture of his body. "Then what is it?" she asked. Marco stared out at the street. "It's the first honest thing I've done all night." The answer hurt because she believed it. She folded her coat tighter around herself. "If Matteo catches you, what then?" Marco let out a slow breath. "Then maybe he finally asks the right questions. And if the answers are worse than you remember?" He turned to her. "They probably are." There was no self-pity in it. Only a terrible acceptance. Elena wanted to say something absolving, something that might reduce the weight between them enough to let them keep moving. Instead, she said, the truest thing she had. "I don't know what to do with you yet." Marco nodded once. "That's fair." He started to walk away, then stopped. Without turning back, he said, "I did love you correctly sometimes, even when I was doing the rest of it wrong." Elena felt tears threaten again. "Go," she said. This time he obeyed. He disappeared into the waking city with the strange, unsteady gait of a man who had spent too long mistaking endurance for redemption. Elena rented a room above a laundromat on Mercer just after sunrise, using cash from the emergency envelope hidden in her boot, one of the few practical habits she had kept from Marco without ever admitting where she learned it. The room was narrow, stale, and painted the color of old cream. She locked the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and finally let herself shake, not sobbing. Not even crying at first, just the body releasing what the mind had bullied forward all night. Her father's handwriting. Victor, bleeding on the kitchen floor. Lucia's face when Matteo said Tomas's name. Marco saying yes, he left. Elena pressed both hands over her mouth and forced air back into herself until the shaking eased. Then she stood, washed her face in rust-tinted water, and examined the brass key in the weak bathroom mirror light. Such a small thing. She thought of all the men who had killed, concealed, bargained, and lied around objects like this, because paper lasted longer than loyalty. At 8:40, she left the room, dressed in a gray coat she bought from a second-hand stall opening for the day. Hair pinned back, glasses taken from a rotating rack near the register, not because the disguise was clever, but because ordinariness often protected better than invention. Bellwether Trust rose over the river quarter like a building pretending not to remember the men who built it. Limestone facade, bronze revolving doors, dark windows polished to a priestly severity. Elena approached from the south side and saw Lucia already at Finch and Mercer, leaning against a newspaper box with a cup of coffee she was not drinking. They made no sign of recognition until they were inside the bank lobby and standing before the marble reception desk beneath portraits of board members, smiling through decades of impunity. "Safe deposit access," Lucia said crisply to the woman at reception. "Private archive level." The receptionist looked up with corporate politeness that sharpened when her eyes landed on Elena's face. It was subtle, but Elena saw it. Recognition not of her, precisely, but of lineage. The woman's smile shifted by a degree. "Name, please?" Elena stepped forward. "De Luca. Elena De Luca. Box 914. The receptionist checked something on her screen. For one long second, Elena thought the entire plan had already failed. Then the woman's expression smoothed again. The box was placed under legacy protocols. "We'll need your identification and one physical key." Elena handed over her passport and the brass key. Lucia placed a leather folio on the desk with the calm entitlement of legal class and said, "I am advising on a state review." The receptionist barely glanced at her. Elena wondered how many crimes had lived and died in buildings like this under the shelter of tone alone. They were led downstairs by a silver-haired manager with dry hands and impeccable manners into a vault corridor colder than the rest of the bank. Metal doors lined the walls in nested grids. Cameras watched from every angle. The manager stopped at a private room with a central table and brought them a long steel cassette after checking the key twice and Elena's face once more. "You may call when finished." Then he left, and the door clicked shut behind him. Neither woman touched the box immediately. They listened first. No unusual footsteps outside. No sudden voices. Lucia drew a breath. "Open it." Elena inserted the brass key. Lucia turned the bank key beside it. The lock gave with a heavy mechanical clunk that sounded far too loud in the small room. Inside the cassette lay a leather ledger half the size Elena expected, wrapped in oilcloth, and beneath it a thinner packet bound with faded blue ribbon. No money. No jewels. Just paper and consequence. Lucia lifted the ribboned packet carefully. "Index," she said. Her voice did not shake, but her hand did, slightly. Elena unwrapped the oilcloth. The ledger's cover was black, edges worn, initials absent. When she opened it, the first page held no dramatic confession, only columns, dates, account routes, coded initials. Reference marks that meant nothing without the index. Ordinary ink, ordinary paper. The banality of evil made her almost angry. She turned several pages. There it was. Transit contracts, customs clearances, municipal sanitation diversions covering off-book vehicle movement. Human beings reduced to systems and entries and liabilities. "We need copies," she said. Lucia was already photographing pages methodically with a small pen scanner from her folio. "We make them, but not here." Elena nodded. "How much do you trust your release network?" Lucia considered. "Enough to start, not enough to relax." She opened the index and went pale at the second page. "What?" Elena asked. Lucia turned the packet toward her. Real names cross-referenced to aliases, as Victor had said. Judges, ministry advisors, police procurement heads, and there, written in neat block letters beside a route classification, was Tomas Varela, flagged not as recipient or witness, but as obstruction. Below that, another notation. Son observed. Driver uncertain. Elena stared. "Driver uncertain," she repeated. Lucia's face had become unreadable. "Your father knew Marco was seen." Elena kept reading. 2 lines lower sat a second note added in different ink. "Cleanup reassigned to M." Her stomach tightened. "M," she said softly. "Matteo." Lucia's eyes met hers. Yes. In that instant, the architecture of Marco's guilt changed shape. He had driven. He had left. But the fatal act, the thing that finished Tomas after the first gunshot, pointed elsewhere. Elena felt no relief, only a painful realignment. Marco was not innocent, but perhaps he had spent 11 years bearing an accusation that should have been more precisely named. Before either woman could speak, the private room door opened without a knock. The silver-haired manager stepped in, too quickly, smile gone. Behind him stood Matteo in a dark overcoat, hands empty, expression almost courteous. 2 security men took positions at the threshold. Lucia moved immediately, sliding the scanner into her sleeve. Elena closed the ledger but kept one hand on it. Matteo's gaze moved over them both, then settled on the open index packet with what looked almost like affection. "There it is," he said softly. "The city's conscience, filed and bound." Lucia stepped in front of Elena by instinct. Matteo noticed and smiled faintly. "You always did confuse prosecution with protection, Lucia. And you always confused patience with legitimacy." Matteo inclined his head. "Beautifully said. Still fatal, but beautifully said." Elena looked toward the cameras in the corner. "This is a bank." Matteo followed her glance. "And? You think you can do whatever you want in here." Matteo's expression barely changed. "Miss DeLuca, this institution has survived precisely because it understands the difference between scandal and inconvenience." The manager stared rigidly at the far wall. Elena understood. Bought, pressured, or merely trained never to interfere with power, wearing a calm face. Matteo stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "I did not come to hurt you," he said. "Not if this goes sensibly." Lucia laughed once. "Men like you always call surrender sensible." Matteo ignored her. His eyes remained on Elena. "Your father was many things, but he understood containment. Marco inherited his anxiety without inheriting his discipline. Victor inherited his imagination without inheriting his stamina. You, however, may still have inherited the useful part." Elena felt the trap in every word. Not just flattery, invitation, a place in the machine. She thought of her father at the window asking if guilt had a shape. Perhaps Matteo had been that shape all along, only delayed. "You killed Tomas Varela," she said. Matteo's face did not alter, but something colder entered it. Tomas Varela forced a room to choose between procedure and panic. Lucia stepped forward. "And you chose murder." Matteo looked at her almost sadly. "I chose continuity. Your family's tragedy began when your father believed exposure and repair were the same thing." Elena opened the index again, fingers steady now, and turned it so Matteo could see the notation. "Cleanup reassigned to M." Matteo's eyes flicked to the line, then back up. "Ink proves less than people imagine." "Then why are you here?" Lucia asked. Matteo smiled. "Because paper in the wrong order destabilizes institutions people still need tomorrow morning." Elena heard the river traffic outside, faintly through the walls. Noon was approaching. Somewhere Marco was moving through the city as bait or memory or both. Victor was either being stitched together or dying in someone else's back room. None of it would simplify this room. Matteo extended one hand. "Give me the ledger. Keep the index. You may even have your performative release later, once names are staged properly. But if you flood the whole architecture at once, people disappear, markets convulse, cases collapse, and the dead stay dead anyway. Your father knew this." Marco learned it badly. You can learn it correctly. Elena looked at Lucia. Lucia's answer was immediate and fierce. No. Matteo barely acknowledged her. Careful, he said to Elena. She has spent 11 years wanting this to mean justice. Those are not the same thing. Elena thought of Tomas. Of her father. Of Marco at 19 leaving a warehouse because power told him to. Of herself sitting in the rented room, finally understanding that love without truth curdles into management. She looked back at Matteo. You keep talking about continuity as if it's neutral. Matteo's hand remained extended. Continuity is what prevents grief from becoming governance. Elena almost admired the elegance of his corruption. Almost. She took the ledger in both hands, as if weighing it. Matteo's eyes sharpened. Lucia made the slightest movement. Maybe to stop her. Maybe to trust her. Elena could not tell. Then she turned, crossed to the polished marble side table by the wall, seized the decorative brass letter opener from its stand, and drove it straight through the central spine of the ledger, pinning pages and leather together in one violent motion, before ripping downward. Matteo lunged too late. The binding split with a ragged crack. Loose pages spilled across the marble and floor like blackened leaves. The room exploded into movement. One security man surged forward. Lucia slammed the heavy steel cassette into his knee with a brutal two-handed swing. He went down shouting. The second man grabbed for Elena's wrist, but she flung handfuls of pages into the air. Contracts, names, cross-references rained across the room, sticking to shoes, sliding under chairs, scattering any illusion of containment. Matteo caught Elena's arm hard enough to bruise. Do you have any idea what you've done? He hissed. Elena met his gaze and, to her own surprise, smiled with a kind of exhausted clarity. Yes. Lucia had already yanked the private room door open and shouted into the corridor, not for help, but with all the legal precision of a prosecutor's daughter, who knew institutions feared certain words more than violence. Fraud, evidence tampering, call federal oversight now. Her voice cut through the vault like an alarm built from class and certainty. Employees looked up. A guard hesitated. The manager blanched. Matteo tightened his grip on Elena, but in that same second, another voice came from the corridor. Let her go. Marco stood there, drenched from rain, face cut near the brow, gun leveled not at Matteo's chest but at his throat. Behind him, astonishingly, came Victor, pale as death and bandaged, one hand braced on the doorframe, and with them a man Elena did not know, in a doctor's coat carrying a phone held high and recording. Matteo's expression shifted for the first time into something unguarded. Not fear exactly, irritation at losing sequence. You shouldn't have come, Elena said to Marco, and hated how much relief broke through the words. You left a very memorable trail, Marco replied, never taking his eyes off Matteo. I thought I'd try one more warehouse day and see if my judgment improved. Matteo's grip on Elena loosened a fraction. Victor said from the hall, voice frayed but steady. It did. Bank security was converging now, but the sight of a prominent trust manager, scattered documents, a gun, a known fixer, and a room full of shouted legal terms had created the one thing men like Matteo despised most: unscripted witnesses. Lucia moved fast, sweeping pages and the index packet into the open cassette, while the doctor held his phone on everything. Federal Archive upload is live, Victor added, lifting his own phone weakly. You taught me movement matters, remember? Matteo looked at him with a quiet hatred that seemed older than any of them. You never had the nerve. Victor's laugh turned into a cough. No, but I finally found people who did. Matteo's eyes went to Marco then, and in them Elena saw the true old relationship, the one that had poisoned Marco's life far longer than he understood. Not mentor, not ally, architect and surviving material. If you pull that trigger, Matteo said softly, you become the story they tell about why all this failed. Marco's hand trembled once. Elena watched him, and knew exactly what this moment was costing. One more room, one more gun, one more older man calmly inviting him to let violence simplify what guilt had complicated. Marco's face changed, not into peace, into decision. He lowered the gun. The move shocked everyone, even Matteo. No, Marco said. I become the witness who stayed. The sentence hit Elena like a door opening somewhere deep inside her. Matteo's expression hardened instantly. He shoved Elena aside and moved for the corridor, but the doctor stepped back, and two bank guards, no longer certain whom to obey, blocked the path on reflex. Lucia used the second to place the cassette directly into the arms of an approaching compliance officer, and say, with terrifying authority, chain of custody starts now. Say your name and the time. The woman, startled into obedience, did exactly that. Other phones were out now. Other eyes. Matteo understood at last that secrecy had ruptured, not because truth was pure, but because too many systems had begun seeing one another at once. He stopped struggling. For the first time all morning, he looked old, not defeated, just forced into chronology. Marco lowered the gun completely. Elena saw his shoulders shake once, almost imperceptibly, as if his body had been braced for an action it had inherited from youth, and now had nowhere to put. She crossed the room and took the gun from his hand. He let her. Bank security separated people. Voices multiplied. Names were demanded. Lawyers were invoked. And somewhere beyond it all, sirens began approaching from the street. Victor slid down the wall to sit on the floor, smiling in that broken, incredulous way of someone who has survived long enough to be embarrassed by it. Lucia stood near him, breathing hard, hair loosened, one hand still pressed over the cassette, as if custody could be enforced by grief alone. Elena looked at Marco. He looked back. No absolution passed between them, no miracle, only the beginning of a different kind of burden, one that did not depend on lies. Outside, the city was fully awake now. Rain had stopped. Through the vault corridor windows high above the lobby, a strip of pale noon light reached across the marble floor, touching scattered ledger pages. Marco's empty hand, Lucia's torn sleeve, Victor's blood on the tile, and Elena understood that endings were never clean in families like theirs. They were only the moment secrecy stopped being the language of love. Months later, when the hearings began and the first resignations turned into indictments, commentators called it a systemic reckoning, a civic purge, a collapse of old patronage webs. They were not wrong. But Elena learned quickly that public language was always cleaner than private cost. Lucia testified like a blade. Victor survived surgery and later disappeared again, this time after leaving enough corroboration to make cowardice less relevant than utility. Matteo refused to confess to anything but process. Men above him denied knowing him even while the index proved how often they had used his discretion. The city endured. It always had. Marco was charged, then retained as a cooperating witness, then denounced by strangers as either a hero or a coward, depending on which part of the story they needed to feel safer about themselves. He accepted none of the labels. Elena visited him twice before the formal proceedings ended. The first time, they spoke for 20 minutes about legal timelines and Lucia's testimony, and whether Victor could ever be trusted not to vanish again. The second time, they sat mostly in silence until Marco said, "I still see that warehouse before I sleep." Elena answered, "You should." It was not cruelty. It was the closest thing to respect she could offer. He nodded as if he understood that. On the day her father's name was finally spoken in open session beside Tomas Varella's, Elena sat in the back row and watched Lucia keep her spine straight through every detail. When the hearing recessed, Lucia came to sit beside her. Neither woman spoke for a long while. Then Lucia said, "My brother hated people who turned suffering into mythology." Elena looked ahead at the emptied chamber. "So did mine, I think. He just failed at it differently." Lucia considered that and gave the smallest nod. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited for statements and certainty and clean morality. Neither of them gave any. There were still families in the wreckage, still names in the index connected to people who had not yet been arrested, only exposed. Still, workers and clerks and drivers and frightened young sons, woven into damage they had not fully authored, and still had to answer for. Elena learned to live inside that complexity without calling it resolution. She kept the torn spine of the ledger in a drawer at home, not as a trophy, but as a warning. Some nights, she took it out and ran her thumb along the split leather, while the city hummed beyond the windows, alive and compromised, and never entirely cured. She and Marco never returned to the house where the gunshot had begun everything. It was sold through court seizure. The kitchen tiles were replaced, the staircase repaired. New owners moved in with children and potted plants, and no reason to imagine the air had once carried that much old fear. Elena was glad for them. History did not deserve every room forever. On the first anniversary of Tomas Varella's formal exoneration, Lucia met her at the river. They stood on the lower dock at St. Bartholomew Ferry Terminal, the place where another version of the story might have ended in bargain and disappearance. Instead, there was only wind, river spray, and commuters waiting for the evening boat. Lucia handed Elena a folded copy of the final judgment. "He's named correctly now," she said. Elena read the line once, then folded the paper shut. "It's not enough." Lucia's mouth tightened, but there was no disagreement in it. "No," she said, "it never was." They stood there until the ferry arrived, until passengers surged around them, until the river darkened under the failing light. Across the water, the city glowed in windows and signals and office towers built on foundations older than any scandal. Elena thought of her father asking whether guilt had a shape. She knew the answer now. It had many. Sometimes it looked like a man in a bank claiming continuity. Sometimes it looked like a brother lowering a gun. Sometimes it looked like a daughter refusing to inherit silence, simply because it had been handed to her with love. When she finally turned from the dock to go home, the wind caught her coat and filled it briefly like a sail. And for one strange second, she felt not peace, which would have been dishonest, but direction.